Thank you for the warm introduction. And I would like to introduce to you the other half of the presenter tonight, my daughter, Amber Ahronian. And just to tell you just a little briefly about Amber, she's a graduate of Dartmouth College Environmental Studies program, and she works at EBI Environmental Research Consultants in Burlington, and really enjoys it. And I thought, well, geez, you know, I'm doing a talk on the environment. Why not ask Amber to help out? So thank you, Amber, for helping. So xeriscaping in the Northeast. You've probably done a lot of reading about xeriscaping in arid states such as Arizona and so forth. And that's where it all started, in that they were trying to find ways to conserve water and also nutrients and maintenance as well in the landscape, and trying to protect our natural resources. But in the Northeast, we also need to start to change our ways in the way that we design landscapes. And my feeling is we can do it 1 yard at a time. And you'd be surprised the difference you'll all make when you start to add up each and every one of you's square footage of your yard and the little bit of changes you're making. It makes a big impact on the climate and also in the community. It helps out in a lot of ways. Not only is xeriscaping helpful with erosion control, it's helpful with not having to mow as much. It's helpful with bringing in pollinators into the yard. And it's helpful on less maintenance, less chemicals. So really, it's really a wonderful thing to save you time as well. And what we're going to talk about is a landscape that we did. I'll show you some pictures of a landscape that we designed in Quincy. And it was at a commercial site. And they were interested in cutting down on so much watering. And I just want to make a comment about lawns, because I don't want you to think I don't like lawns. I love lawns. I love my lawn. But I love it where I need it. And so this education is about having your lawn where you really need it, you know, a play area or a path. But the other areas really don't need all lawn. It's time to change our ways and to bring in some plants that aren't going to need, like I mentioned earlier, mowing every week, watering every day, treating it with chemicals to keep it good looking. You know, just so much maintenance and care. So just think, if you take half of your yard and you slowly introduce this xeriscaping, just how much more quality time you're going to have for yourself, and the time you'll have in the gardens that you want to keep, how you'll be able to keep them up much better because you will have more time. So we're going to show you a picture. And so this is an example of xeriscaping in the Northeast that Ahronian Landscaping designed in Quincy. There are many things to take into consideration with xeriscaping. We, as I say, don't have the arid conditions here, but we do have water concerns, and we do have water bans. And we do have many different microclimates. And so when we're taking a look at a landscape design, and we're designing something, we need to understand that we have some trees that are going to provide some shade underneath, that we can use plants that actually only need moderate watering. And so we don't have to use actually a xeriscape plant in those areas because they're a little cooler and a little bit more moisture. So there's opportunities to mix in natives and also ornamentals within the plan. So when we look here, we see that we've got some of those microclimates with shade, and we see that we've got some other areas that are much more sunny. And because we're not, this all was just lawn. There was just lawn, nothing else. But because we don't have lawn, we want to be able to be interactive in the garden. And so we design in a path to get you somewhere to sit down and relax and enjoy it. So even though we don't have lawn, we do want access, and we want to have movement in the garden. And we want to take a lot of things in consideration. Many of these plants are xeriscaping plants, which I'm going to get to in the next slide. But we also want to accomplish a bunch of other things within the landscape. We want to have a sequence of color or interest so that there's something going on just about every week within the landscape. We want to have wildlife and some beautiful birds maybe in the garden if we're bird lovers. And we want to have fragrance. We want to basically connect with all the senses so that when you are in the garden you feel good. And the sense of aroma and the sweet smell of something makes you feel good. There's something about aromatherapy, and it's important. But also it's important to have color, and it's important to have movement in the garden. So when you see ornamental grasses and they rustle with the wind, it's very pleasing for a person. And we want to have contrast. And so we have a purple leaf plum tree that is actually a xeriscape tree. They can take drought conditions as well as heat. They're very, very durable in that respect. They're not a very long-lived tree, but long enough to enjoy in our landscaping. Blue spruce is a xeriscape tree. Blue spruce can take drought conditions as well. Very hardy, extremely hardy for our area. And again, the contrast of the blues and the purples and the reds and the white is what we want to see. We don't want to see what we used to call in the 50s ring around the foundation of just a row of shrubs. We want to see a garden, and we want it to be welcoming and inviting. And so Hydrangea Paniculata is a very hardy hydrangea. It's not a xeriscape plant, but it doesn't need as much water as the other hydrangeas, the macrophyllus, like the endless summer hydrangeas. And once established, just moderate watering is necessary. So that's something that you can play with. It's nice to have some white with blue in the landscape. And Amber, I think you're up next.
Okay, so now that we've gotten a bit of a background on xeriscaping in the Northeast, I just wanted to go over some of the theory behind it. So if the challenge is that with development and urbanization, there's a lack of resources or greater demand on our resources, then we kind of have to change our ways. We kind of have to find ways to use the resources more responsibly so that they'll last longer. And while it's a challenge, it's also an opportunity, because this doesn't mean we have to get rid of our favorite plants. It just means we can be more responsible in how we use them and more creative about our plant selection to include natives that require less inputs. So it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity, and I think we can get creative in our gardens and keep the beauty, but also think about the environment and be in harmony. So the goal, as I was sort of talking about, is to create a functional, pleasing, easily maintained landscape that complements its natural surroundings. We don't want to work against natural processes. We want to work with them, and we can. And that would be fulfilling and sustainable. So the way we do this is by incorporating climate, regional weather, microclimate, soil, water and plant relationships into the design plans. So from the beginning, we're thinking about all kinds of things. So if you go next. For example, when we're thinking about irrigation and maintenance, we want to start with that. So, you know, you can group plants that have similar irrigation needs together. And you can group plants together that have different root depths so that they're not competing over water, but are using it in a complementary way. We also want to, as my dad was talking about, reduce turf in high water use areas. So while we all love our Kentucky bluegrass and other cool season turfs, they use a lot of inputs. And especially on slopes, we want to use low water use vegetation to control erosion and runoff. So if you go to the next slide, we have a couple of alternatives to turf. There's the Pennsylvania sedge and the woodland strawberry. And my dad's going to talk a bit more about the Pennsylvania sedge, but to give you an idea, these are alternatives that are native to the area. You can walk on them. They don't require much water. They don't require much mowing, if at all. And they attract pollinators because pollinators they're used to the native species. And when you plant native species, you maintain those systems that have been here for I don't know how long. And so there are all these different benefits, and you're not getting rid of this space where you can have open area for playing soccer or whatever you do with your lawn, but you're using something that's a little bit different, and it's native, and it's a xeriscaping plant. So another principle is to amend and aerate the soil. And amending with compost, we all love compost, I bet. But that's better than using synthetic alternatives because it holds onto water and nutrients more effectively. And so we can just use better what we already have there and add fewer inputs. And if we reduce the soil disturbances with things like plowing, then we can maintain the soil aggregates that allow water to infiltrate in, and that way we don't have to irrigate quite as much. The fourth principle, I think, is probably the most important, my opinion, but we're going to get into that quite a bit. It's to select the appropriate plants. So favor native species. Like I said, you know, they've been here forever, and you don't have to work as hard to sustain them because they sort of come built in with those abilities themselves. They work with the natural processes. And when you plant with an awareness of the climate, you reduce inputs of water, fertilizer, pesticides, and time, which we all don't have enough of. And so just plant within the hardiness zones. If you're going to plant something ornamental, something exotic or introduced, try to plant within the cardinal temperatures of it to prevent stress, because when there's temperature stress on a plant, it increases the susceptibility to pestilence and disease. And there's another area where we have to put in inputs. So the fifth principle is to mulch the soil, which probably we do anyway, but that reduces evaporative water loss because the water can't escape quite as readily if there's a layer of mulch there. And in the summer, that's extra important. And it also helps to prevent erosion and keeping those soil aggregates strong so that we have the infiltration. And, you know, we can just allow plant debris to remain if there are lawn clippings or that sort of thing. If it gives more nutrients to the environment, why not? Just let it be. That's something to consider. And the sixth is when we do have to irrigate, to do it responsibly and efficiently. And so you can use drip irrigation. It's a much more efficient method of irrigating than others. And you could consider collecting rainwater or even gray water to use instead of just from the hose. And the seventh is to develop an efficient maintenance program. So you don't want to, you know, in the early season, you don't want to overwater because then the plants will grow to a point where they'll be extra to maintain, and they might be more. Say there's a water ban and you've just given your plants all of this water they've grown, and now you have to maintain them. How? Instead of doing that, you know, you could just use a signal plant, for example, like a sunflower, herbaceous, large leaves, so you can see, oh, okay, the leaves are starting to wilt, now I'll water. But if the leaves don't wilt, then you don't need to be watering. And most gardeners, or more gardeners, kill their plants with overwatering than underwatering. And, you know, there are some other tricks like not pruning or fertilizing when there's a water scarcity. That one makes sense because it stimulates growth to prune or to fertilize. And then, again, you have the issue of trying to sustain something that's a little bit unsustainable. And irrigating in the early morning when the wind and evaporation are lower. So there are all kinds of tricks. But to get back to my favorite principle, selecting the appropriate plants, my dad's going to talk a bit about some xeriscaping plants.
So Chinese fountain grass is a xeriscaping grass, and although you might think that all grasses love a lot of water, there are grasses that can take drought conditions and very hot spots. And so when organizing your landscape, it's important to identify the hot areas and use those plants that like their root systems to be with heat. Some even do very well next to pavement. They can really take the heat, their root system. So it's important to know what plants those are when you're planning your landscape so that you have good results. And like any other hobby, if you have good results, then you want to maintain your hobby. But if you're putting the wrong plant in the wrong spot and it declines, you know, then you're disappointed. It's usually because it's the wrong plant in the wrong spot. So it's important to do a little research first. And so fountain grass is a nice medium-sized grass, and it really adds and helps with layering so that not everything is at the same layer in the landscape. Next. Carl Forrester grass is a really nice favorite of mine. It sort of gets this more of an autumn color in the fall, late summer, and is a little bit taller. And we often will use them to hide something. It might be a drainage pipe or a hydrant or something like that, and we'll use that to hide. But you see that it's a different height, and so we're trying to have some layering in the garden, different angles too, so that when you're walking down the path, you have lower things along the path that can take the heat from the pavers of the stone path, and then get some more height after that. So Carl Forrester is a really nice grass. Indian rice grass over here is a little taller, a little sort of in the middle, if you will, and is a little bit more delicate looking, and it has a whole different appeal to it. You can see just how delicate it really looks. And again, it's adding another plume color within the landscape. Knockout rose is a gardener's favorite. And they are definitely, all the rose family, and I'll tell you, the best thing you could do with planting a rose is to add some sand in the soil. They really like a well-drained soil for their roots, and they prefer not to be watered all the time. They really can take some heat, and the problem with, you know, a sort of a spray head sprinkler, it sprays everything, and like Amber was pointing out, a drip irrigation, you can be more choosy with who's getting water and when. And if we're watering roses too much, they're not going to be happy, and their health will decline and they'll start to get sick. And when we have a plant that's weak, it's attracted to insects. Insects are attracted to that plant. So we want to make sure that we're not overwatering these plants. And certainly when you're planting a new plant, we need to give it water to get it started for several weeks. But then we need to back off. And we need to be careful of the conditions of that particular plant and what that plant likes. Next. Ornamental plum, I mentioned earlier, is actually, the plums are edible. They're small. That's more of an ornamental. They, too, can take drought conditions, and they add so much more contrast to the garden. Next. Blue spruce. Again, so now we have this cluster of trees, and it creates a microclimate in and around them where it's cooler and a little bit more moisture. So then we're allowed to use something like this Hydrangea Paniculata, which would need a little bit more moisture than the rose. So two different places and placement of plants so that they're happy. And so that's what's kind of different about xeriscaping in the Northeast, is that we have different opportunities. We don't have just a low plane of arid conditions like like when you go and you see that it's all one level. We have so many different situations. Some of these arid states, the wind is so fierce that trees really don't get too tall. And so that kind of narrows down possibilities for microclimates. So desert-like is what I was trying to think of earlier. So next, daylilies. Daylilies, you think that daylilies have to have a lot of water. But actually, they too can take drought conditions. They do need a moderate amount, but they can handle quite a bit. They're tough. They can handle the sun. There are daylilies that take the shade. And so you can have different opportunities to use daylilies in partial shade as well. But they're a lot tougher than you think they might be. And they really don't need to be watered every day. Next. Shasta Daisy. And there's a couple areas of Shasta Daisy. Another nice plant that's a xeriscape plant. Can take the sun and the heat. Flowers religiously every year. Tough plant. And again, very little watering. Next. Veronica. There's another nice xeriscape plant that can also take heat. This one's going by, but I think we got another picture of Veronica. When they're out in full, they really make a big splash of color. And that's a plant, again, like the daylilies. You just let them go, and they will multiply on their own and get larger, and they will create a bigger splash of color as they, you get into year 4 and 5. They really start to get a much larger clump. Next. Serviceberry amelanchier takes part shade. It's also a xeriscape tree for the Northeast. Hardy, can take it dry, not a problem. Very tough, but it also has nice little white flowers and also berries in the fall. So it's going to give you some interest a few times a year. They're also great for screening. You can see it was used to screen out some parking area just to soften it up a little bit, because they're multi-stem and they have small leaves, and they just kind of soften the building there. Absolutely. This is serviceberry amelanchier. And you need to have some vertical elements in the garden to break things up. So we can see this tall brick structure. As I mentioned, it's a commercial site. It's a pretty big building, and we needed to have some height to soften that up a little bit. Coreopsis is a great a perennial flower, and there's many varieties of Coreopsis. Coreopsis is tough. It will seed itself. It will take over an area, but that's what we wanted in this area. We wanted it to be full, slow down the weeds from coming up, to have a nice mass of a Coreopsis that will give us some summer color. And, you know, think about your color scheme. You know, this is a hot garden, so, you know, lots of sun, so we probably want to have colors of red and yellow and maybe orange and gold. But we mix in a few other colors too, but try to have a theme for most of the gardens, a color theme. Blue fescue is a wonderful little short ornamental grass that is really hardy, and it's a xeriscape grass. They really don't want a lot of water, and a lot of times they end up, customer will have a problem because they've overwatered it. They really want to be left alone, and they have really unique blue silvery color to them too, which is nice for contrasting. Very short, maybe foot high. Next. So the Pennsylvania sedge here. And this is what we're talking about. If we're not going to be using this area of the yard for dining or playing or walking, and you can walk on it, that's not an issue, but this is an area that has some trees and things, and there's not enough room for a play area. So why mow it every week? Why not do something like this that looks lush and green, and will attract some pollinators? And you can prune it back if you choose to. If it gets floppy from a storm or something, you want to prune it back, go right ahead. But you really don't have to prune it much. Yes, sir?
Will it grow in the shade?
Yes, absolutely, would take shade. Yep.
How do you prune that back?
Well, you could use a mower on a high setting, or you could use a string mower, or shears, electric shears, or basically cutting it back. Most people cut it back at the end of the season. But if you have a terrible summer storm and it's floppy and it doesn't seem to come back, but I would say wait, because once it dries out, it should stand again. But you can cut it back, but you don't have to. It's not going to get too tall. Yes?
How does this attract pollinators, and is there a blue flower on it? And what pollinators does it attract?
Yes, definitely it's going to attract some pollinators, but the one I'm going to show you next is actually the one that's really going to attract the pollinators. But this too is offering escape for in a hiding place for insects and, you know, valuable insects. So it does attract wildlife, and of course you've got some other things growing there too that is going to attract wildlife.
Not bees, though. It doesn't attract bees.
No, I'm going to show you another one that will, though. Yes?
Do deer eat that?
No. Nope, they do not. They do not eat it. Next. This is catmint, and catmint is a xeriscape plant, and again, very tough, likes the sun, but it will take a little shade, and definitely will attract some pollinators. Potentilla Fruticosa is a very dainty plant, small leaves, comes in different colors. This is my favorite one of them, but there is an orange, and there's a more golden color, and there's a white with a yellow center. Potentilla is tough. It loves it dry and doesn't really want to be watered. The one thing about Potentilla, though, I'll say, is that it takes a long time before it leaves out. It leaves out, one of the last things that leaves out, and really, well into May before it's going to leaf out. So people think it didn't make it, but actually they did. And they flower later in June with a big splash of color, and then they flower periodically through the summer. So very generous plant. And so that would be the one thing, is that you probably wouldn't want a big cluster of it in the front walkway area, because it's going to look like, geez, it didn't make it. So I would probably plant it out a little bit further and away from the walkway, and appreciate it later on in the season, because it is what it is. So unless you just wanted to plant one, maybe. But if you plant 5, it's going to be brown. So. Next. Bicolor Oak Tree. Wanted to give you another tree, too. So, and Bicolor Oak is very colorful. It's a small tree. It's about 40 feet in height and about 30 feet in width. Certainly manageable for the yard. The leaves are not as large as a white oak, and it doesn't have the big margins in the leaf and the big cutouts. Excellent xeriscape tree. It, again, can take drought conditions tough. Takes a lot of summer heat, and excellent fall color. So very pretty for, again, sequence of color right through the fall. Sedum, the succulent family. There's many different sedums. This is a pretty popular one, Autumn Joy, but there are many that grow very low to the ground. They can take the heat, and they really don't want to be watered much. And excellent for the ground cover sedums along a walkway or a pool area. They give you that nice carpet effect. And then if you wanted to use some taller sedums further out in the garden, there are many that are taller as well. Very, very colorful. This one doesn't bloom until late August, September. So again, you want to have that sequence of color, and it does attract pollinators. Next. Lilac. Now, you wouldn't think lilac is a xeriscape plant, but actually the lilacs can take quite a bit of drought conditions and in hot weather. Lilacs, some people have a hard time getting them to flower. They like manure, actually, to be spread around them, and they like lime. So if you lime them every year and you put a little fresh manure around them, they'll be very happy, and they'll flower prolific. But they want the sun, and they want air circulation. If they're not getting air circulation, they can get mildewy and that sort of thing. So lots of circulation for air movement. And the other most important thing, too, with lilacs is the way you prune them. They should be pruned on it's called a rotational method of pruning. So we go in and we take out the oldest canes or stalks, and those are usually the weakest wood, and the pith inside is weak and soft, and that's where borers move into lilacs. So you want to look for holes in those older canes, prune those out, look for crossing branches that when the branch crosses and the wind blows, it creates friction, and it eventually creates a wound. So we're going to prune for health with a lilac first. Prune out the older canes, prune out the crossing branches, look at what we've got left, and now we're going to shape it. So we're not pruning for shape first, we're pruning for shape last, realizing that it's going to grow in and be full in time. So important to prune them properly. You can't treat them like everything else. Next. Zinnia is a great annual, and they are, really beautiful in the late summer and early fall. And they're a xeriscape flower. And although you'd have to plant them every year, they really are worth it. They give you a little height in many different colors too, and they like the sun. You can plant them right next to the sidewalk where there's heat from the sidewalk for their root system. It's not going to be an issue. Next. Cosmos is a great plant. It's also an annual, but Cosmos is really good at reseeding itself. So although it's an annual, it'll probably come back in the same spot it was in because it's going to drop seeds there. So if you wait a little bit in the spring and you don't turn the soil where the Cosmos was, you'll probably get a surprise. You'll get a free one. And Cosmos is wonderful. It also is attracting for pollinators and gets you a nice height. Now, the one problem with Cosmos, it can get floppy. They get quite tall, so you do have to stake them, but I think it's worth it. Salvia as a xeriscape plant, and sometimes it's nice to have some blues in the garden, especially in the summertime. Next. Iris, another one. People think they want tons and tons of water. They really don't. They really don't want it. And if you do overwater, they will decline. The bulb will start to get soft. They really don't like it. So let it have the sun and let it be dry. And you'll have gorgeous irises. Next. Juniper. Juniper's a great plant. You know, they're great because there's different colors. This one's blue with toni. Now this plant is tough. You can plant it right next to the road, and the salt will get on it. People drive on it. It won't die. It is really tough. The only thing I find is occasionally there may be a weed or two you got to pull out if you see them growing in it. But once they get thick, there's no stopping them. They're tough. And also, you know, they're solving a landscaping problem. When you have a slope that comes down to the road, it's tough to mow that. You're on your side trying to mow. Well, put the juniper there and let that be on the slope, and you never have to mow again. Wonderful plant. It solves problems. So, next. So landscapes of the future, conserving natural resources, pollinators, sequence of movement, color, and interest in the garden is so important. And we need to take all of these things into consideration. We don't want to just find a plant that's listed as a xeriscape plant and we throw it in there. We need to have a design. We need to have a reason for using that plant. Just like we had a reason for those junipers on that slope, we need to have a reason whether we're trying to create more layering or more texture or more color in the garden, a little more height, and that plant fits that spot. And as we get further away from the heat and into some trees with some shade, then we know we have another different condition that now we can plant other things. We have other opportunities that do not like full sun. And that gives us that larger palette of plants that we can use in that site. And again, we want to have harmony in the garden. And so, you know, helping out those honeybees and having delightful places that we can go, little escapes within our own yard to sit and relax or have a cup of tea or maybe a cocktail is important for us to be healthy. And anything else here do we have? Or yeah, further reading if you'd like to get some books on xeriscaping, and it will help you with your plant palette that you might want to choose. And that's all we have.